The heavy steel doors of the alien prison slammed shut behind him. Daniel Briggs, an old human with silver hair and tired eyes, stood calmly in the center of the dimly lit room. He did not struggle. He did not resist. Instead, he let the alien guards shove him forward, forcing him into a cold metal chair. His hands were already bound behind his back with strange glowing cuffs, but he showed no concern. Across from him, Commander Veckler of the Selvan Dominion sneered, his green reptilian face twisted into amusement as he studied the human before him. "This is the great Daniel Briggs." Veckler laughed, his sharp teeth glinting under the light. "I expected something. More." The other alien officers in the room chuckled. Daniel remained silent, his face unreadable. Veckler leaned closer, his yellow eyes gleaming with curiosity. "You were caught trespassing in a restricted zone," he said. "Our forces identified you as a potential spy. We considered executing you on sight, but we decided it would be entertaining to interrogate you first." Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm. Steady. Too steady. "You made a mistake." Veckler's smile faded for a brief second, but he quickly covered it with a smug grin. "A mistake? No, human. The only mistake was yours. Do you realize where you are?" He gestured to the walls. "This is a military flagship. You are alone, surrounded by some of the most dangerous warriors in the Dominion. There is no escape." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "No escape." He let out a small chuckle. Veckler's eyes narrowed. "Something funny, human." Daniel ignored the question. He shifted slightly in his chair, testing the restraints. "Do you know what happened the last time someone tried to arrest me?" Veckler scoffed. "Yes, your human military came to rescue you, didn't they?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "That won't happen this time. We jammed all your signals. No distress calls. No one knows where you are. You are completely alone." Daniel shook his head, his smile never fading. "I wasn't talking about my military. I was talking about me." The room fell silent. Something about the way he said it made the officers uneasy. A cold sensation crawled up Veckler's spine, though he quickly dismissed it. This was just an old man, a weak, frail creature. Humans were inferior. There was no reason to be afraid. Veckler signaled one of the guards. "Take him to the lower cells. We'll begin the real interrogation soon." The two heavily armed Selvan guards grabbed Daniel's arms and lifted him from the chair. They were rough, pulling him forward, but he did not resist. As they dragged him toward the hallway, Daniel sighed. "I gave you a chance," he muttered. Veckler raised an eyebrow. "A chance? To do what?" Daniel looked back at him. "To let me go." Before Veckler could laugh, the lights flickered. A low, deep hum filled the air. The ship trembled, just for a second, but enough for every officer in the room to feel it. The guards stopped walking. Their grip on Daniel's arms loosened slightly as they exchanged nervous glances. Veckler frowned. What was that? One of the officers checked the ship's internal systems. "Commander, we just had a power fluctuation. No known cause." Veckler's frown deepened. He turned to Daniel. The human was smiling. It was not the smile of a helpless prisoner. It was the smile of a man who knew something they didn't. The ship trembled again. This time, the lights dimmed for several seconds before returning to normal. The guards tightened their grip on Daniel, but something had changed. The air felt heavier. The room was too quiet. Veckler's instincts screamed at him, but he refused to show fear. "Take him away," he ordered. The guards obeyed, dragging Daniel out of the room. But as they stepped into the hallway, the ship's alarms blared. "War in unauthorized system access as DTTTED." Veckler's eyes widened. "What?" The officers scrambled to their stations. Screens flashed red with security alerts. One of the officers turned pale. "Sir, the ship's AI is being overridden." Veckler slammed his fist on the table. "By who?" The officer hesitated. I don't know, sir. The signal is coming from inside the ship. Veckler felt a chill run down his spine. He turned toward the hallway where Daniel had been taken. The alarms continued to wail. The ship shook again, harder this time. And somewhere down the hall, through the chaos, Daniel's voice echoed. "You should have let me go." The alarms blared through the ship, red warning lights flashing along the hallways. The Selvan guards holding Daniel tightened their grip, their claws digging into his arms. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew one thing. This human was dangerous. Commander Veckler rushed to the control panel, barking orders. "Find the source of the system breach. Now." His officers scrambled, their fingers flying across the holographic displays. The ship's AI refused to obey commands, its once smooth voice now distorted with static. One officer turned to Veckler, panic in his yellow eyes. "Commander, the security locks on multiple doors are disengaging on their own." "What?" Veckler's heart pounded. "Which doors?" The officer swallowed hard. "All of them." The ship trembled again, this time more violently. The Selvan crew stumbled, gripping onto control panels and walls to steady themselves. The guards dragging Daniel looked around nervously, unsure whether to take him to the lower cells or return to the bridge. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "You're starting to understand now, aren't you?" One of the guards snarled and shoved him forward. Quiet, human. But Daniel didn't seem to care. He walked steadily, as if he already knew what was coming next. The hallway lights flickered wildly, and the temperature in the ship began to drop. Cold mist seeped from the vents, curling along the floor like ghostly fingers. The lead guard hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. "Commander, something isn't right." Before he could finish his sentence, the ship lurched violently to the side. The artificial gravity flickered, causing the guards to momentarily lose their balance. Daniel, however, remained standing, perfectly still. The lights shut off completely, plunging the hallway into darkness. For several seconds, there was only the sound of alarms, static-filled warnings from the failing ship AI, and the heavy breathing of the Selvan guards. Then, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the hall. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, a sound that did not belong on this ship. The guards stiffened, their reptilian eyes darting around in the darkness. What was that? One of them hissed. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. The backup lights flickered on, casting eerie red glows across the metal walls. Shadows danced wildly, shifting and stretching unnaturally. Daniel smiled. The ship's speakers crackled, and then a voice, not human, not Selvan, but something else, whispered through the system. "He warned you." The guards turned, weapons raised, but the moment they moved, the doors lining the hallway burst open one by one. Cold air rushed through, carrying with it a presence, an invisible force that sent every Selvan soldier to their knees in terror. Daniel finally spoke. "It's too late now." And then the real nightmare began. The ship groaned like a wounded beast, its metal frame shuddering, as if something ancient and powerful had taken hold of it. The emergency lights flickered, struggling to keep the darkness at bay. But the red glow only made the shadows stretch longer, twisting, shifting, moving when no one was looking. The Selvan guards, once confident and cruel, were now shaking, their sharp claws gripping their weapons tightly. Their training told them to act, to fight, but their instincts, the deep primal part of their minds, screamed at them to run. Daniel stood among them, still calm, still unbothered, his silver hair catching the dim light. He looked around, as if he had been expecting all of this. The tapping sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the hallway, but this time, it came from multiple directions. It was as if something unseen was moving through the walls, the floors, the very structure of the ship itself. The lead guard bared his fangs, gripping Daniel's arm. "What did you do?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do anything. You did." The ship lurched again, harder this time. The Selvan crew on the bridge screamed as control panels sparked, consoles shut down one by one, and the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated. Commander Veckler slammed his fist on the command panel. "Status report. Tell me what's happening." A terrified officer turned toward him, sweat dripping down his scaly face. "Commander, the ship is locking us out. The AI is unresponsive. Something else is controlling it." "Impossible," Veckler growled. Another officer shook his head. "Sir, it's not just the AI. The ship itself is changing." Veckler's rage turned to confusion. "What do you mean, changing?" The officer gulped. "The internal layout is shifting. Hallways are no longer leading to the right sections. Doors we locked before are now opening on their own. We try to go to one part of the ship, and it takes us somewhere else, like it's alive." Veckler's sharp claws dug into the metal table. This wasn't a simple system failure. This wasn't sabotage. This was something far worse. Back in the hallway, the Selvan guards holding Daniel began to realize the same thing. Their grip on him was still tight, but their breathing had changed. It was quick, ragged. Fear had taken hold. Daniel finally sighed, shaking his head. "You aliens, you never listen." One of the guards aimed his weapon at him. "Tell us what's happening. Right now." Daniel smirked. "Why don't you ask them?" The moment he said it, the emergency lights cut out completely. Total darkness. And then, the screams began. They weren't coming from Daniel. They weren't even coming from the guards near him. They were coming from the other end of the hallway. The guards spun around, their night vision useless against whatever was lurking in the shadows. Shapes flickered at the edge of their vision. Something tall, something thin, something wrong. A cold wind rushed past them, and with it came a whisper. It wasn't in any known language, but it still sent an instinctual terror through their bodies. One of the guards took a shaky step back. "W, what is?" A clawed hand shot out from the darkness and yanked him away. His scream was cut short. The remaining guards barely had time to react before the hallway became a storm of chaos. Shapes lunged from the darkness, grabbing, pulling, tearing into Selvan bodies before they could even fire their weapons. The creatures, if they could even be called that, weren't solid. Their forms shifted, flickering between shadow and substance. They moved too fast, too impossibly smooth, like nightmares made real. One guard tried to run, but the walls themselves warped, the metal shifting into a jagged mess of twisted spikes. He stopped just in time, staring in horror at the living, shifting corridor. He barely had a second to scream before something yanked him upward, and he was gone. Daniel, still standing untouched in the middle of the carnage, watched with an almost bored expression. One last guard remained, his weapon shaking in his hands as he pointed it at the human. "Dildu, what are you?" he stammered. Daniel took a step forward, and the guard immediately flinched. "You aliens think you understand the universe," Daniel said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You think you're the ones in control, but you never stop to ask, what happens when you mess with something you don't understand?" The guard's breathing was ragged, his eyes darting wildly. The hallway was completely silent now. Everyone else was gone. Daniel took another step forward. "You captured me. You brought me here. And now," he smiled, "now you live with the consequences." The emergency lights flickered back on for just a second. The last guard barely had time to react before a black tendril lashed out from the floor, wrapping around his ankle. His eyes widened in horror. "No, no." The tendril jerked him backward into the shadows. Silence. Daniel took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as if waking up from a nap. The glowing cuffs around his wrists snapped apart on their own and fell to the floor. Then, without hurry, without concern, he began walking toward the bridge. It was time to have a chat with Commander Veckler. Commander Veckler stood frozen, his sharp claws gripping the edge of the control panel. His officers were in chaos, screaming, pressing buttons, trying everything to regain control of the ship. But it was useless. Something else had taken over. The ship's internal layout had changed. Doors led to the wrong places. Entire sections of the ship had vanished from the maps. Security cameras showed nothing but darkness. And worst of all, the crew was disappearing. "Commander," an officer shouted, his voice trembling. "We've lost contact with all guards in Section 3. No response from Hallway 7 either." "Impossible," Veckler growled. "They were transporting the human prisoner through that corridor." "Find them. Now." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the life signs from that area have gone completely dark." Veckler's throat tightened. That meant only one thing. They were all dead. His sharp yellow eyes narrowed. "Show me the last camera footage from that hallway." The officer hesitated again before pressing a few buttons. A flickering, distorted feed appeared on the screen. At first, there was nothing but red emergency lights and fog rolling through the corridors. Then, movement. The guards were still alive, weapons raised, dragging the old human forward. Then the screen glitched. For a moment, a dark shape appeared behind them. Tall, wrong, moving unnaturally. The footage distorted again, and suddenly, the guards were gone. All that remained was the human, standing completely still. And then he looked directly into the camera. Veckler's breath caught in his throat. He felt the stare, even through the screen. The human wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He was in control. The video cut to static. The entire bridge was silent. Every officer stared at the screen, too afraid to speak. Veckler's claws dug into the metal. Where is he now? The officer's fingers trembled as he checked the security feed. He paled. "Sir, he's coming this way." Veckler spun around. "Seal the doors. Activate the sentry drones. Prepare tow." Boom. The bridge doors exploded inward. Smoke filled the room. Officers coughed, covering their faces. Through the haze, a shadow stepped forward. Daniel. His silver hair was untouched, his old military coat hanging loosely around his shoulders. His hands were in his pockets, as if he had just taken a casual walk. The security drones activated instantly, their weapons locking onto him. Veckler roared. "Open fire." The drones obeyed. Energy blasts filled the air, streaking toward the human. But not a single shot hit him. The bullets and energy rounds froze in midair, vibrating as if struggling against an invisible force. Then, slowly, they reversed direction. The drones didn't even have time to react before their own fire ripped through them, tearing them apart in a storm of metal and sparks. The officers stumbled back in terror. Veckler clenched his fists. "What are you?" he growled. Daniel tilted his head. "You really don't recognize me, do you?" The commander bared his fangs. "You are nothing but a primitive deathworlder, a relic of an old war. Your kind is weak, scattered, broken." Daniel chuckled softly. "Is that what they told you?" He took another step forward. The air around him rippled, as if reality itself bent in his presence. The lights above flickered violently. The walls groaned like something alive. A deep, suffocating presence filled the room. Veckler's officers started gasping for air. One by one, they collapsed to their knees, shaking. Daniel kept walking. "You see, Commander, I was never your prisoner. You were mine." Veckler snarled, lunging forward with his claws. "I'll tear you apart." He swung, but his attack never landed. Daniel simply raised one finger. Veckler froze midair. His entire body was suspended, caught in an unseen force. His claws were inches from Daniel's face, but they couldn't move. Pain shot through Veckler's body. A crushing weight pressed down on him, growing heavier by the second. He choked, struggling to breathe. His vision blurred. His bones creaked. Daniel leaned in, his voice a whisper. "You should have left me alone." With a flick of his finger, Veckler was thrown across the room. He crashed into the far wall with a sickening crack. Collapsing in a heap, he coughed, struggling to rise. His officers were too afraid to help him. Daniel turned, his eyes cold. "Now let's talk about how this ship belongs to me now." And with those words, the nightmare truly began. Terror gripped the bridge. The officers stood frozen, their gazes locked on Daniel. The air itself felt heavy, as if some unseen force pressed down on them. Commander Veckler coughed, struggling to rise from where he had crashed against the wall. His ribs screamed in pain, but he forced himself to stand. He would not show weakness, not to this thing. Daniel simply watched him, calm, unshaken. The old human's silver hair caught the dim red glow of the emergency lights, and for the first time, Veckler realized this was no ordinary prisoner. "You." The commander's voice came out hoarse. "What? What are you?" Daniel took a slow step forward. The remaining officers flinched, their hands hovering over their weapons, but they dared not draw them. They had seen what happened to the drones. "That's the wrong question," Daniel said, his voice even. "The real question is, why am I here?" Veckler gritted his fangs. "We captured you. You were helpless." Daniel smirked. "Funny thing about that. You ever wonder why you found me alone on that planet?" Silence. Daniel's smirk widened. "I was waiting for you." The weight of his words sent a shiver down Veckler's spine. Waiting? No, that couldn't be true. His fleet had detected the human's shuttle floating in deep space, a lifeless wreck. They had assumed he was a survivor of some battle, maybe a lost soldier from a forgotten war. "You're lying," Veckler snarled. "You were stranded. Your ship was." "Exactly where I left it," Daniel interrupted. His gaze darkened. "I let you take me. I let you drag me onto your ship. And now, you're trapped with me." Something cracked in the air. The metal walls groaned. The lights above flickered violently, sending long shadows stretching across the room. The officers backed away, their breathing ragged. Then the alarms changed. A deep guttural klaxon rang through the ship. Not the standard security alert, something worse. "Sir," one of the officers gasped, looking at the main control panel. We just lost control of the reactor." "What?" Veckler's eyes widened. Another officer spun around. "Sir, our coordinates just changed. The ship it's moving." Daniel took another step forward. The pressure in the air intensified. "Your ship belongs to me now," he said simply. Veckler's claws dug into his palms. "Impossible. You can't override our systems. Only a verified." He stopped. A cold realization settled in his gut. Daniel just smiled. One of the officers hesitantly checked the control panel and paled. "Commander," his biometrics, "they're in the system." Veckler froze. No, that was impossible. Only high-ranking officers could have access to the ship's core systems. The only way a human, this human, could do that was if he had clearance. Veckler's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" Daniel rolled his shoulders, stretching slightly. "You know, it's funny," he mused. "You aliens have such long memories. You remember every war, every battle, every empire that's ever fallen." He met Veckler's gaze. "And yet you somehow forgot about me." The commander staggered back. The weight of those words crushed him more than any invisible force. "Forgotten? No, that wasn't possible. There were legends, stories of a human from the old wars, a man who never should have existed, a man who had been erased from history because his name alone sent fear through the stars. A ghost of war, a nightmare in human form." Veckler's heart pounded. You're dead." Daniel smiled. "Do I look dead to you?" The ship lurched. The overhead speakers crackled to life, and a distorted voice echoed through the bridge. "New destination confirmed. Arrival in T-5 minutes." Veckler's eyes darted to the control panel. His hands trembled as he read the new coordinates. His stomach dropped. No, 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 no. Daniel watched calmly as the commander panicked. The ship was now heading straight toward a dead zone, a place no vessel ever returned from, a place humans once called the graveyard, a place where an entire alien armada had been destroyed long ago, by one man. The bridge crew fell into chaos. Officers scrambled to override the controls. They failed. Others tried to send distress signals. No response. Veckler turned to Daniel, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. You're taking us to hell. Daniel chuckled. Commander, you were in hell the moment you arrested me. The final countdown began, and the nightmare was only getting started. The ship trembled as it neared its destination. The alarms blared a desperate warning, but the crew could do nothing. The control systems remained locked. No commands worked. No override codes functioned. The ship belonged to Daniel now. Commander Veckler gritted his teeth, his claws digging into the armrests of his chair. His officers worked frantically, sweat dripping from their foreheads. But the truth was clear. They were prisoners aboard their own vessel. And the worst part, they were heading straight for the graveyard. Veckler had heard whispers of the place, a cursed sector, a void where entire fleets had vanished. No distress signals had ever been received from there. No survivors had ever returned. It was as if the very stars had swallowed them whole. And now, they were heading straight into it. Sir, an officer gasped. The coordinates. This is a classified sector. No ships are supposed to enter. I know. Veckler snapped. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He turned his gaze toward Daniel. The old human stood calmly at the center of the bridge, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. There was no panic in his eyes, no hesitation, only satisfaction. Veckler's breath came out in sharp bursts. His mind raced. He needed to think. He needed to act before. Warning. Arrival in 1 minute. The cold, robotic voice sent a fresh wave of terror through the crew. Veckler lunged at Daniel. You'll kill us all, he roared. Daniel sidestepped effortlessly. With a flick of his wrist, he gripped Veckler's arm and twisted. The alien let out a pained snarl, feeling his strength vanish in an instant. Daniel threw him to the ground like a ragdoll. The entire bridge crew froze. Veckler, the feared commander of the fleet, lay defeated at the feet of an old human. Daniel crouched beside him. His voice was calm, but his words cut like a knife. You think I'm leading you to death? He tilted his head. No, Commander, I'm taking you to the truth. Veckler panted, his mind spinning. What? What do you mean? Daniel stood up. His eyes darkened. You aliens erased history. You wiped out the records. You thought you could bury the past. His voice turned sharper. But I remember. The ship lurched. The stars outside shifted. They had arrived. A deep, unnatural silence filled the bridge. The alarms stopped. The flickering red emergency lights dimmed. And then, the screens lit up. The crew turned, eyes wide in horror. Outside, floating in the abyss, were the wrecks of thousands of alien warships. Huge, twisted hulks of metal drifted in the void like ghosts of a long-forgotten war. Some were barely recognizable, scorched, torn apart, covered in deep scars from impossible weapons. Others floated in eerie silence, their dark hulls whispering stories of their destruction. The crew stared in disbelief. This was no ordinary graveyard. This was a massacre. One of the officers stumbled back, eyes darting between the wreckage and Daniel. His voice was barely a whisper. This was a battle. Daniel nodded. The greatest battle your kind never wanted to remember. Veckler's claws dug into the floor. Who did this? Daniel's expression didn't change. He simply raised a single finger and pointed at himself. Veckler's stomach dropped. No, he whispered. That's impossible. The weight of realization crushed the bridge crew. They hadn't just arrested some old human. They had arrested the architect of their greatest defeat. Daniel took a step forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You wanted to know who I am, Commander." His gaze burned with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. "I am the last survivor of this battle." His tone was razor-sharp. "The one human you couldn't kill. The one you tried to erase from history." Vekler couldn't breathe. His mind raced through the history he knew, the rewritten history. No records mentioned a human like this. No reports detailed this battle. It had been hidden, buried. And now, the truth was standing right in front of him. Daniel turned toward the main control panel. With a single touch, the ship obeyed him. "The past always catches up, Commander." He exhaled. "And now, it's time for yours to return." Before Vekler could react, something moved outside the ship. A shadow stirred within the wreckage. Something was waking up. A deep, unnatural hum filled the ship as the wreckage outside began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just the faintest movement among the dead hulks of metal. Then it became impossible to ignore. Something was waking up. Vekler's claws scraped against the floor as he pushed himself up, his breathing ragged. What is this?" His voice barely carried over the eerie hum vibrating through the ship's walls. Daniel didn't answer. He simply watched, waiting. The bridge crew stared in horror as the wreckage outside started to glow. Lines of faint blue light pulsed across the ruined ships. Broken weapons twitched. Burned-out engines flickered back to life. And then, they moved. A shattered warship, its hull torn apart, its decks exposed to the void, shifted. Pieces of metal, floating for centuries, suddenly snapped back together. Its shattered weapons began to reconstruct themselves, reassembling as if time itself was reversing. All around, more wrecks stirred. Vekler's breath hitched. "That's not possible." His crew backed away from the viewports, terror in their eyes. These weren't just dead ships. They were repairing themselves. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it carried a chilling certainty. "This is what happens when you try to erase history." Vekler turned to face him, rage and fear battling within his expression. "What did you do?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "You think your kind won that war. That humanity was wiped out." He shook his head. "No, your leaders just sealed the battlefield. They thought if no one entered this sector, the truth would never come out." His gaze darkened. "But I knew the day would come when someone would be foolish enough to bring me back here." Vekler's eyes widened. "You planned this." Daniel gave a small nod. "I needed a way back in, and you gave it to me." Before Vekler could react, the ship's lights flickered violently. The control panels flashed warnings. "System overriddt. External command accepted." The wrecked ships outside were no longer just rebuilding. They were activating. A forgotten fleet was waking up. One of the officers let out a strangled gasp. "Sir, new energy signatures. These ships are powering up. Weapons, shields, everything." Vekler's stomach dropped. This wasn't a graveyard. It was a sleeping army. And they had just unlocked it. Daniel turned, stepping toward the command chair. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who had been here before, someone who had already fought this battle once. He sat down. The ship's controls immediately responded to his presence, screens flashing to life. "This is your last lesson, Commander," he said without looking at Vekler. "You can erase records. You can rewrite history." He gripped the armrests, his voice turning into a quiet, dangerous growl. "But you can't erase the past itself." Outside, the first of the ancient warships turned its cannons toward the alien fleet. Their nightmare had just begun.